Something that I'm extremely curious to hear you speak about at length is a lot of people, to my understanding, are completely unaware of how negative and deleterious the FDA is in practice.
Oh
That
yeah.
oftentimes there are many drugs that are actually preventatives for cancer and all these other things. And it's much easier to get a drug approved that is a tweak on a pre-existing medication than something that is innovative because you have to go through human trials. As a result of this, many lives are actually being lost. I have a friend who's an investor in this field, and he just really regards it as a malevolent organization because, like, we have technology right now. If I'm definitely going to die, if I have a terminal illness, just let me be the experiment because what have I got to lose kind of situation? The answer is no. Can you please, from your professional experience, speak a bit about how the FDA works in practice, and if what I'm just saying is accurate at all?
It is accurate. It is a toxic organization. And for years, when I was affiliated with a biotech company, the one thing they tell you is FDA never forgets. It's like almost like a threat. Like if you say something that's critical of FDA, you're going to actually get deep state treatment. And this is stuff that like in the pharmaceutical industry is well known, right? So if you start using words like deep state, you're like, oh, you're like some sort of rube on the outside, not scientifically sophisticated. But in the industry, it is an adage among people in the regulatory functions of pharmaceutical companies. FDA never forgets. That's not the way the system's supposed to work. The FDA has a limited grant of statutory power. Their decisions, actually, people forget this, are challengeable through the federal court system. But when they say FDA never forgets, they mean that if you're in the industry and you're playing by the rules, like the genteel rules of being treated well, if you're one of those companies that actually challenges an FDA ruling, you won't be treated well the next time around, right? They have, I mean, it is such a corrupt bureaucracy. It's funded by user fees from the companies. The companies themselves are repeat players with the FDA. The decisions made by some technocrat you've never heard of. I mean, this is a guy wielding undue political and economic power, and even power over the health of lives of people across this country who could be getting medicines a lot faster and a lot more cheaply if the FDA didn't apply its draconian regime the way it does, selectively, by the way. For some drugs and some vaccines, it has to take 10, 12 years or it can't be the case. In other cases, COVID, whatever it is, we're going to develop that in record time, say that it's so safe and effective that we're going to back mandates to actually use it. You can't believe these things at the same time. It's just bureaucratic shooting from the hip. It is a toxic organization that I intend to reform with a first personal understanding of how corrupt that bureaucracy actually is. And you know what? Now that I'm not part of a biotech company that I founded, I'm finally not only free to talk about it, I also intend to run the federal government. As the chief executive of this country ought to run the federal government, right? The biggest myth that we have in American constitutional self-governance is this idea that the people who we elect to run the government are the ones who actually run the government. They don't. It's the permanent state that runs the show. I'm going to fix that, right? So that's part of, and I can get into the details and the mechanics of how I do it, or we don't have to do that here. Maybe that's for, another, I don't know. I have no idea what your audience is interested in. You know that better than I do, but
No, they're very interested in this because this
really?
is something where I mean, this is something where there's just a lot of glib discussion. But when you get to the nuts and bolts of the situation, it's so much more darker and disturbing. And corporate media like CNN or Fox, not asking you to disparage them, but they have these 5-minute clips, and you're not going to get an understanding of how systemic this rot is. And what that means is this isn't like, oh, I can't get soda at the store. This means that, someone who has prostate cancer is dying when they don't need to be dying. This means someone's going through chemo when there's another medication they could take that's not going to bring them as close as possible to the brink of death and holding up in abolishing the cancer. So, and this is something you're not talking as a politician. This is something you've lived, and this is how you made your money. So please do speak on it at some length, because I think it's extremely crucial and totally undiscussed.
So, or that when that therapy does make it, it's 5 times more expensive and I can't afford it because the FDA actually created that monopoly. And then the FDA companies arbitrage them back. They use then the FDA as a safeguard to prevent somebody else from being able to cross the same finish line.
Can you explain what you mean by that? What you just said?
Yeah, I mean, it gets sort of technical. So the FDA has to approve a label, right? So it's like the drugs, side effects, and safety, and whatever. So what they do is they game the system a little bit. You're only supposed to have 5 years of exclusivity, or the years that you have until patent expiry. Those are the 2 forms of exclusivity. But then what they'll do is they'll patent something in the label, like the dose form that's in the label, but make it really hard for a generic to make that same kind of dose form. And then because that's patented, the generic company can effectively give you something that's basically the same thing. But because they have to go through the FDA process, they say that if you want to get the same label, then you actually had to do the full swath of trials, even though the entire FDA regime was set up, the entire drug approval process was set up on the premise that after your patent expires, generics have a rapid path to market as long as they demonstrate the same biological and chemical qualities without having to go through human clinical trials. And so pharma companies will patent the way the label is written to use the FDA as a blocking channel from what the patent system told the generic companies that they were free to do. All of this contributes to the higher cost of drugs in this country. It's just game playing. Now, do I even blame companies for this?
Of course,
No.
they have to. If you're a CEO and you don't do this,
Yes.
you're out in your ass because you're leaving all the money on the table.
Yeah, so I'm not criticizing. Exactly. You get it. Thank you. I'm not blaming, and the irresponsible thing that Joe Biden will do, we'll talk about the greedy oil companies or the pharma companies. I mean, there's a lot wrong with pharma companies. I don't like it when they lie. That's a separate question. But this kind of behavior is just doing what a pharma company is expected to do. When they lie about saying we're going to then also implement a racial equity program and talk about systemic racism and climate change. That's a deflection to get the public away from being mad about these other things they're doing. That's the lying part. But the part where the company is doing what's responsive to its own self-interest, I don't blame the company for that. I blame the government for creating this toxic labyrinthine game that actually leaves the public holding the bag.